Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for having this series of excellent hearings, and to all of you who are before us today. The chairman mentioned earlier that you were a very efficient panel, and you are also a very distinguished and informative one, and I want to thank you for being here. I was interested as a writer of Amtrak, as well as a flyer, in some of the reports last week in the wake of the Philadelphia tragedy about potential price gouging among airlines. And the derailment obviously was a horrific event, and I know you join me in expressing our sympathies to all the loved ones and all who were affected. But I wonder whether Mr. Schmisek, as an executive for United Airlines, can you confirm whether these reports are valid, whether they've been exaggerated? If the FTC were to look at these fares, what would they conclude? I just want to mention that a $2,309 flight from D.C. to LaGuardia would be an example of potential price gouging, and I want to just emphasize, I am not asking you because I am pointing to United Airlines in any way or form as potentially one responsible or accountable. I'm just asking for you as an informed airline executive whether you
Sure.
can comment.
Thank you. I'd be happy to respond. First, let me express my condolences to the families and loved ones of those killed in the terrible tragedy in Amtrak. Absolutely not, sir. Speaking for the United Airlines, we would never take advantage of an opportunity like that if you viewed it as an opportunity. No one would do that. It is true that as people book closer into a flight, the ticket prices tend to go up because those flights, that inventory, which of course, as you know, evaporates every time the flight takes off without someone in that seat. That inventory disappears, and therefore that inventory is priced more towards last-minute business travelers who tend to have a willingness to pay more because they're traveling on business. When you have a tragedy such as Amtrak, you have a sudden rush of demand for the very few remaining seats in those high inventory buckets. Those prices are high, but we would never raise prices in connection with it.
So you would attribute any increase in prices to just
those are last-minute fares, an open inventory reserved for business travelers, for people booking at the last minute. What we saw was certainly a surge in demand for tickets, and the only available inventory was the last-minute business inventory.
Mr. Rinaldi, did you have a comment?
On the ticketing? No.
Well, I would join you in the strong feeling that that kind of price gouging would be utterly reprehensible. And if there is any indication, certainly I will call on the FTC to investigate promptly, as perhaps this committee would have a role as well.
Sir, I would join you in that call.
Thank you. And speaking of that derailment and the aftermath when rail transportation was stopped, I think we saw in the reaction among passengers in rushing to the airlines that the lack of adequate rail transportation has an impact on airlines. These systems are all interconnected, and the present air transportation system can become so congested that it simply can't serve all of the riders who are diverted from rail. And so I would ask the panel whether you have any observations on the importance of rail in assuring adequate and efficient airline transportation, simply in providing a necessary link that relieves some of the congestion in the airlines.
Senator, certainly from our standpoint, as an agency of the Transportation Department, we work very closely with our colleagues across all of the modal agencies to ensure that we have connections and linkages, and that the system is being appropriately managed as a total system. One of the things that we've been very focused on is how do we link modes of transportation together, and a lot of that, as you well know, is rail access to airports to ensure that there is a seamless transportation network across that spans many modes of transportation. But clearly, there is a relationship.
And finally, I have one last question for maybe Governor Engler and Senator Dorgan. You know, the need for investment in these systems seems so apparent, even obvious to us, and we have a virtually full room here. But the public still doesn't seem to be mobilized, and this Congress seems to be divided. Do you have some advice based on your political wisdom and your experience on how we do better to raise awareness and generate support? Because obviously both of you have longstanding experience in doing so.
You know, the prioritization is tough, but I do have one observation that it makes little sense to try to build railroads in the desert in California when we've got a Northeast corridor that we truly ought to make a premier showcase corridor for passenger rail and separate passenger rail from freight rail on the corridor. And so maybe reining in some of the ambitions in other parts of the country while we fix the corridor that matters the most would be my thought on that. I would also suggest that the subsidization costs of different modes, one of the things you've heard from Mr. Smisek and from, I think everyone, and maybe at the panel today, air has been pretty good about paying its own way, and it's been pretty heavily taxed. That's not necessarily the case, certainly with rail and with transportation. While states have been willing to raise fuel taxes, we know that form of tax is probably, you know, it's coming to an end at some point, and there is a need for a solution. I'm hoping that we can get, Senator, into the broader question of tax reform and buy ourselves maybe a few years while we sort out how we're actually going to fund highways and bridges reconstruction of the country. That's a big unmet need.
I don't know that I can offer you much advice, except to say that we've painted ourselves into a fiscal policy corner. We've had a dozen years of war that we haven't paid for, and we have so much. Well, I chaired the appropriations panel on energy and water. We had $60 billion of authorized water projects and $2 billion a year appropriation. You know, this stuff doesn't add up, and it's true in transportation. It's true in a wide range of areas of infrastructure. So I just think we have to do better on fiscal policy and make investments in the country if we're going to have the kind of country we want in the future.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you again, and particularly Mr. Rinaldi. I want to thank the extraordinary work by our air controllers across the country, most especially in Connecticut. I met with a number of them earlier today, and they are often the unappreciated and unacclaimed heroes of our air transportation system. So thank you for being here today.
Highly trained, highly skilled professionals. They do love their job.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.